Hello, I'm Sarah Thompson-Copsey and welcome to today's session for MBL seminars on adverse possession and boundaries, the key principles. Adverse possession and boundary disputes are often terribly tied up with one another. Many of the cases that we're going to be looking at today, and even those cases that we're not looking at today, we've only got an hour, so we can only deal with some of the matters, start with a boundary dispute and end up in adverse possession. And even in adverse possession, in today's world, the best or the easiest perhaps, or the most common way of claiming adverse possession is going to be by arguing that there's a reasonable mistake as to boundaries. So they're completely wrapped up in one another. In a case called Zarb against Parry, that we'll be looking at later today, the dispute was about where the boundary line actually lay. And the Zarbs are absolutely right. The boundary line lay exactly where they said it lay. And yet, for enough period of time, the Parrys have been in adverse possession. And so in spite of where the boundary line actually was, the land, the disputed area of land, actually belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Parry through adverse possession. So the two are completely wrapped up together. So we're going to look at both today. We're going to start by looking at adverse possession. We're looking at what is actually meant by adverse possession. So we'll be looking at things like factual possession, the intention to possess, and the evidence that you need to support such a claim. And we'll be looking at what is meant by the concept of without consent. We'll then be looking briefly, it's a sort of only an overview here, at the transfer of ownership. And there are effectively two regimes, as you probably know. One under the Limitation Act 1980, which everybody calls old-style adverse possession, and one under the Land Registration Act 2002, which everybody calls new-style adverse possession. Whilst we'll be looking at both regimes to some extent, we won't be going into the nitty-gritty of the forms that you need and the applications that must be made to the land registry, because that isn't something we have time to do in a 1-hour session. And I run a course for MBL where we look at those in much more detail. But I will draw your attention to one or two sort of little tricky areas around both of those regimes. And then we'll be looking at the end at why boundaries are crucial. And of course, we've already indicated that boundaries and adverse possession are completely wrapped up in each other. And I've given